Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. Now, a few days ago, I checked out the Ryzen 9 7950X and I found it to be a productivity monster, crushing the Core i9 1200K with ease. However, it was also quite a bit more expensive than the i9. So today, we're taking a look at a Zen 4 processor that's priced to compete with the 1200K, and that processor is the Ryzen 9 7900X. With an MSRP of $550, it's actually slightly cheaper than the Core i9, so it'll be interesting to see how they stack up, and of course I will get to the benchmark results as quickly as possible, but before we do, let's go over the 7900X specifications. What we have here is a 12-core, 24-thread Zen 4 processor that clocks between 4.7 and 5.6 GHz depending on the load, and like the 7950X, we're getting 2 core complex dies or CCDs, along with a 6nm I/O die. The additional CCD means there's a total L3 cache capacity of 64 MB, and there's also a total of 16 MB L2 cache. The TDP has been increased from 105 watts for the single CCD models, such as the 7600X and 7700X, to a whopping 170 watts, though do note, because the same I/O die has been used, the same 28 PCIe 5.0 lanes are supported. Now, whereas the 7950X is coming in $100 lower than its predecessor, the 7900X carries the same MSRP as the 5900X, so $550 US. That said, it's worth noting that the 5900X can be had for just $400 these days, which is an almost 30% discount from the MSRP, and of course the price of the 7900X. Still, compared to Intel, that should be a competitive price, with the Core i9 12900 starting at $510 for the locked version, $560 for the 12900KF, and then $580 for the full-blown 12900K, which we'll be comparing to the 7900X in this review. Really, there is a lot more to go over, but we'll talk about many of the new features and changes as we work through the review. So let's go over the test system specs and then get on with it. For the AM4 platform, I've got a range of Zen 2 and Zen 3 CPUs with popular models such as the Ryzen 5 3600, Ryzen 7 3700X, and of course the Ryzen 5 5600X, but there are half a dozen more models included. I've then got the Intel 10th Gen Core series with popular models from the i5, i7, and i9 range, and due to time I have skipped the 11th Gen as we believe it to have been a bit of a flop. Then for the 12th Gen Core series processors, I've tested using DDR4 3200 dual rank CL14 memory and DDR5 6400 single rank CL32 memory, and I've included from the Core i3 12100 up to the Core i9 12900K for this comparison. Then finally, the new AM5 test systems based on the MSI Meg X670E Ace, and AMD has insisted that all reviewers use the supplied DDR5 6000 CL30 memory, so that's what we've done. Finally, please note for all of this testing, we did use the GeForce RTX 3090 Ti, Windows 11, and resizable bar was enabled for all test configurations. Okay, let's get into it. Just quickly before we dive into the blue bar graphs, here's a look at clock behavior in Cinebench R23. After an hour of load testing, the 7900X maintained an all-core frequency of 5.1 GHz on the primary CCD, and then 5.05 GHz on the secondary CCD. So there's just a single % frequency discrepancy between the 2 core complex dies. These results were achieved using the Be Quiet Pure Loop 2 FX 360mm liquid cooler installed inside the Be Quiet Silent Base 802. Then, for single-core workloads, the 7950X appeared to maintain a clock frequency of 5.625 GHz, so 25 MHz above the advertised clock frequency. Now, as usual, we'll start with the Cinebench R23 results, and we see that like the 7950X, the 7900X is also able to quite comfortably beat the 12900K, scoring 7% higher in the multi-core test. It was also just 12% slower than the 7950X, which is quite good given that it packs 25% fewer cores. As we found with the 7950X, the single-thread performance of the 7900X is very strong, producing a score of 2,034 points. That's certainly not a big improvement over the 12900K, just 3% in fact, but it does mean the 7900X is often going to have the upper hand for productivity workloads, given it's faster in Cinebench R23 for both multi and single core performance. Now, when it comes to compression work, the 7900X is again able to outpace the 12900K, this time winning by a 7% margin. So not a massive difference, but a win all the same. Again, the 7900X is seen trailing the 7950X by 12% margin, so not a bad result all things considered. Decompression work is really where AMD's Ryzen series goes to work, and the 7900X is no exception. basically matching last season's 5950X to make it 45% faster than the 1200K, so an easy win here for AMD's new 12-core processor. The 7900X was also dominant in Blender, trailing the 7950X by just an 18% margin, making it 16% faster than the 5950X and a whopping 30% faster than the 1200K. And it's a similar story with the Corona benchmark. Here the 7900X was 26% slower than the 7950X, but 13% faster than the 1200K and a massive 28% faster than the old 5900X. The Premiere Pro 2022 performance is impressive, as has been the case for all Zen 4 CPUs, particularly the 7700X and up. The 7900X was 33% faster than the 1200K and just 7% slower than the 7950X, so another great result here. AMD's new 12-core processor also stood up strong in the Photoshop benchmark, despite coming in behind the 7700X and 7950X. Still, a score of 1,488 points meant that it was a whisker faster than the 1200K and 21% faster than its predecessor, the 5900X. The 7900X did fall behind the 1200K in the After Effects benchmark, though the margin was slim with just 4% in it. So a negligible difference there, but not so much when compared to the 5900X, as here we see a 31% uplift. So again, an impressive generational improvement. Now, the last productivity benchmark we have for you looks at code compilation performance, and here the 7900X can be seen matching the 5950X and 1200K, taking 3,188 seconds to complete the workload. Not amazing given it did only match the Core i9 processor, but overall a decent enough result. Now, time for the gaming benchmarks, and we'll start with Factorio, which is very cache sensitive and really only looks at single core performance. Interestingly, the 7900X produces the highest score here of all the Zen 4 processors, though we're only talking about a 1% increase from the 7950X, so within the margin of error. Still, from our 3-run average, it was consistently faster. The 7900X also nudged ahead of the 7950X in Watch Dogs Legion, though overall performance was much the same, coming in just 2% slower than the Core i9 12100K. As we've seen in the previous Zen 4 coverage, Rainbow Six Extraction isn't a great title for AMD's new Ryzen processors, but it's not a bad one either, as the 7900X trailed the 1200K by a mere 4% margin. Where Zen 4 has impressed is in Hitman 3, and the 7900X basically matched the other Ryzen 7000 series processors already tested with 229 FPS on average, which meant it was delivering 12900K-like performance. Tiny Tina's Wonderlands has been included not because it's a very CPU-demanding game, but rather because it's a good representation of how CPU-demanding many modern games are. That is to say, when using a relatively modern CPU, most games are going to end up being GPU-bound, even when using an RTX 3090 Ti at 1080p, as we see in this example. This game can be useful for testing low-end CPUs, but for the 7900X, it just shows us that we're able to max out the RTX 3090 Ti here, matching other high-end CPUs. Next up, we have F122, and like the rest of the Zen 4 lineup, the 700X is impressive here, delivering similar performance to what we've already seen from the 7600X, 7700X, and 7950X. As a result, it did outperform the 1200K by a 12% margin, and put away the old 5900X by a convincing 25% margin. As seen previously, the Spider-Man Remastered results for Zen 4 aren't that impressive, with the 12700K and 12900K enjoying commanding leads here, and the 700X does nothing to change that, matching the 7950X with 114 FPS on average, and that did make it 13% slower than the Core i9. As I've mentioned previously, it does appear as though we've reached the limits of the RTX 3090 Ti and Shadow of the Tomb Raider, using the high quality preset at 1080p, as all high-end CPUs have hit a brick wall at around 190 FPS, and as a result, the 7900X is only on par with the 1200K here. Now, previously I had thought a similar thing with Horizon Zero Dawn. Perhaps the 3090 Ti just wasn't capable of pushing past 200 FPS, but Zen 4 has proven that theory wrong, reaching just over 210 FPS. The 7900X matched the other Zen 4 CPUs we've tested, so while impressive, it was really no faster than the 6-core model. Cyberpunk 2077, like Spider-Man Remastered, it isn't a great title for AMD, as here the new Zen 4 CPUs trailed Intel's entire Alder Lake K-SKU series. The 7900X was a lot slower than the 1200K, trailing by a significant 14% margin, which was really disappointing to see, but I suppose not unexpected given what we'd already seen from the 7600X, 7700X, and 7950X. The 7900X, however, doesn't disappoint in ACC, though it also doesn't surprise us, matching the other Zen 4 CPUs almost exactly with 173 FPS on average, making it just 5% faster than the 1200K. As was the case with the 7950X, the 7900X is a bit broken in the Riftbreaker. Realistically, it should be able to at least match the 7600X, if not the 7700X, but as we saw with the 7950X, this game has an issue with the dual CCD design of the 12 and 16 core models, and this is something AMD is in talks with the developer to try and solve. Now, the last game tested is Counter-Strike Global Offensive, and again, the 7900X has no surprises here for us. That said, it was a whisker faster than the 7950X, with 518 FPS, and that made it 15% faster than the 1200K, so a convincing win here. Now, onto the 12-game average, and as expected, the 7900X matched the 7950X, making it a fraction faster than the 6-core 7600X overall, and a mere frame slower than the 12900K. So in other words, the same performance as the Core i9. So that was all very much as expected given what we've seen so far. We've also seen that in terms of power consumption, Zen 4 isn't that impressive, typically worse than Zen 3 when it comes to performance per watt, at least based on this Blender data. The 7900X did push total system usage to the same level as the 10900K and slightly higher than the 12700K. Then when compared to the 5900X, the 7900X was 24% faster in this test, but also pushed system consumption 47% higher, so much worse here when it comes to performance per watt. That said, it was faster than both the 12700K and 12900K, quite a bit faster in fact, and it did use a bit less power than the 12900K. So at least relative to Intel, it is a big win here for AMD. Now, when it comes to cooling, the Zen 4 CPUs intentionally give the impression that they're difficult to cool by delivering as much performance as possible while taking full advantage of the thermal and power headroom. AMD says with the new AM5 socket and higher TDP, Zen 4 processors will run into a thermal wall before they hit a power wall. This means under heavy load, they'll sit at TJ max, which is about 95 degrees Celsius for the Ryzen 7000 series, and this will be particularly true for the 12 and 16 core models. Now, AMD has stressed that this behavior is intended and by design, and they say it's important to note TJ max is the maximum safe operating temperature, but not the absolute maximum temperature. In the case of Zen 4, these processors are designed to run 24/7 at TJ max without risk of damage or deterioration. They also went on to say that 95 degrees isn't running hot, rather Zen 4 will intentionally go to this temperature as much as possible under load because the power management system knows this is the ideal way to squeeze the most performance out of the chip without damaging it. As a side note, some good news here being that almost all AM4 coolers will be compatible with AM5, the only exceptions being those that are secured from the rear side of the motherboard, as the backplates aren't removable for AM5 boards. This means all coolers can now be installed without requiring rear access to the motherboard, so that's excellent news. Now for thermal testing, we're using the Be Quiet Pure Loop 2 FX 360mm liquid cooler, which is 100% compatible with AM5. After an hour of looping the Cinebench R23 multi-core test with the Pure Loop 2 FX installed inside the Be Quiet Silent Base 802, we recorded a peak CPU temperature of 97 degrees for the primary CCD and 94 degrees for the secondary CCD. So just above the 95 degree TJ max that AMD says the CPU targets for maximum performance. Okay, time for the value analysis, and as we found with the 7950X, the 7900X is really overkill for gamers and largely a waste of money if all you plan on doing is gaming. Currently, you're faced with paying a little over 40% more per frame than the 7700X when just taking CPU costs into consideration. The 7900X is slightly better value than the 12700K, but much worse than the 12700K. Now let's take a look at cost per frame while also including memory and motherboard costs, which for the DDR4 configuration includes a 32GB kit of DDR4 3200CL14 memory at a cost of $200 US, then the DDR5 6000CL30 and 6400CL32 kits both cost $280 US. Then for the motherboards, the AM5 models are based on the $290 MSI Pro X670-P Wi-Fi. AM4 uses the Asus TUF Gaming X570-Plus Wi-Fi, which costs $180, And then we have the MSI Pro Z690-P DDR4 at $180 and the MSI Pro Z690-A DDR5 at $210. Here the 7900X doesn't look great when including platform costs. It's slightly worse value than even the 1200K and considerably worse value than the 7700X and 7600X. So again, if you're just gaming, the 6 and 8 core Zen 4 processors are far better value. Now, when it comes to productivity, the 7900X looks far more impressive from a value standpoint. It's not quite as good as the 7950X based on the Cinebench R23 scores, but even so, it's comparable to the Core i9 1200K. It's about 15% more expensive per 1000 points when factoring in not just the CPU cost, but also the cost of the motherboard and memory. In short, the 7950X package costs 13% more, but offers 30% more performance. So if you're serious about productivity, you might as well just go all out. The 7900X looks a bit more competitive from a value perspective in Premiere Pro, costing just 9% more than the 7700X when looking at price to performance. It's also much better value than the competing Intel parts. That said, if performance is the ultimate goal, then paying a premium for the 7950X will be worth it. The Ryzen 9 7900X, it's certainly an impressive product, but in a way it's also somewhat of an unfortunate product. Because while it's quite good at everything, in terms of value it's just not that great, even when looking at specific workloads. For example, gamers are certainly better off going with the 7700X, as it's generally faster and of course much cheaper. And even when factoring in platform costs, the 8-core model is considerably better value for gamers. Then, for those of you interested in productivity, it's almost always going to be a case where buying the 7950X ends up being the better deal. When factoring in motherboard and memory costs, it's not much more for an additional 33% cores, and those extra cores often net you a good amount of performance. The fact that the 7900X ends up costing $46 per core, whereas the 7950X is $44 per core, is also less than ideal. Perhaps with cheaper B650 motherboards and a drop in DDR5 pricing, the 7900X will start to make sense, but I think the fact that you're paying more per core by default is one of the key issues with the 7900X. It's certainly not a bad product when compared to the Intel Core i9 1200K, it stacks up very well, but I also think it's the least compelling offering in the Ryzen 7000 series. I'll certainly continue to reevaluate the 7900X with cheaper boards and as platform costs come down, but unless AMD discounts this part, I can't see it being all that popular. And that is going to do it for this review. If you liked the video, you know what to do. Subscribe for more content. We also have Floatplane and Patreon, so if you want to sign up to either one of those things, you'll get more Hardware Unboxed goodness. We have an exclusive Discord server for members. We do a monthly live stream for members only. You can ask us questions. Tim and myself get together and do that. It's a lot of fun. Behind the scenes content, Tim's building a new studio, and Q&A stuff. So yeah, if you're interested, check that out, but if not, perfectly fine. And I would like to thank you for watching this video. I'm your host, Steve, and I'll see you again next time.